The sun was just beginning to dip behind the California hills, casting golden shadows over the sprawling estate that loomed above Beverly Hills like a castle from another world. Locals spoke of it in hushed admiration. The gray stone mansion, 55 rooms, $3 million, hand-carved oak, marble staircases, secret passages. It was the kind of place that seemed immune to the pain of the world, built by a family whose fortunes were etched in black gold. And yet, behind its stone facade, the house kept secrets that no amount of money could silence. Edward Ned Doheny Jr., the heir to one of the greatest oil empires in American history, had only just moved in. Tall, sharp-jawed, and charismatic, Ned was the golden son of Edward L. Doheny Sr., a titan of industry who once made headlines for striking the first oil well in Los Angeles. From the beginning, Ned had been groomed not just to inherit wealth, but to carry the family's legacy into the new century. He did so with style. The mansion, a wedding gift of sorts from his father, stood like a monument to American ambition, built with every luxury, every indulgence that power could buy. On its lush, manicured grounds, Ned hosted Hollywood stars, political heavyweights, and elite financiers. And always at his side, more trusted than any business partner, more constant than any friend, was Hugh Plunkett, his loyal secretary, confidant, and, some said, something even closer. Hugh was quieter than Ned, slighter in frame, with brooding eyes and a sharp mind. He was known to be fiercely protective of his employer. The two had grown up in overlapping social circles and had formed a bond that spanned more than a decade. Where Ned was a public figure, Hugh operated in the shadows, managing appointments, protecting Ned from scandal, and taking on burdens that didn't always appear in the ledgers. To the outside world, everything seemed perfect. But Greystone wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. And behind its thick walls, tensions were rising. Guests and staff whispered about long hours in Ned's study, closed doors, voices raised late at night. Others noted Hugh's nervous glances, the way he flinched at sudden sounds. Something had changed between the two men, something no one could quite name. Still, life inside the mansion carried on. That cool February evening in 1929, as Lucy Doheny put her children to bed and the servants settled into their quarters, there was no sign, none at all, that before the night was over, the house would fall silent. Death was coming to Greystone, and it would arrive not as a thief in the night, but as a mystery that would echo through the mansion's stone halls for nearly a century. The morning after a party at Greystone always followed the same rhythm, the clink of crystal glasses being collected, the murmur of servants resetting lavish rooms to perfection. The scent of cigars and perfume still hung in the air, blending with fresh polish and cut flowers. But this morning, February 16th, 1929, was different. There had been no grand celebration the night before. No music, no stars, no laughter echoing down the marbled corridors. Just a quiet unease settling over the mansion like dust no one dared sweep away. Lucy Doheny, elegant and reserved, had become adept at pretending things were fine. She had stood beside Ned for over a decade, borne 5 children, and endured the public eye with grace. But lately, she'd begun to sense it, an invisible wall creeping into her home. Conversations halted when she entered a room. Hugh's polite distance had grown colder, more withdrawn. And Ned had stopped smiling the way he used to. That morning, Lucy tried to keep the house moving like clockwork. Breakfast was served, staff were given instructions, the children's tutors arrived. But behind the symmetry of daily life, something offbeat pulsed just beneath. In the East Wing, where Hugh Plunkett had recently begun staying, the light from the tall windows seemed harsher. The long hallways echoed more than they should. Housekeeper Anna Mitchell, who had worked for the Doheneys for years, later recalled how she had knocked gently on Hugh's door to remind him of a morning delivery. No answer, just a low murmur, talking perhaps, followed by silence. By mid-afternoon, the mansion was unusually quiet. Hugh hadn't left his room. Ned was nowhere to be found. When Lucy sent a servant to check, they were told not to disturb them. "Mr. Doheny is in conference with Mr. Plunkett," the butler explained. Nothing unusual on the surface. The two had met often, sometimes for hours, but there was something about the way the butler said it, flat, rehearsed, like he wasn't quite sure it was true. And then the phone rang. Dr. Ernest Fishbaugh had been summoned to the mansion more than once. As the family's physician, he was familiar with their anxieties, real and imagined. But this call was different. Lucy's voice was steady, almost too calm. "We need you to come. Quickly. Something's happened." When he arrived shortly before 11 p.m., the house was still. The staff had been sent away from the East Wing. Lucy met him at the door, her expression unreadable. She didn't explain, just led him up the long staircase and down a corridor lined with art that suddenly felt too expensive, too cold. They found Hugh standing outside a guest bedroom, his hands shaking, his face pale. He looked up at Lucy and the doctor, eyes wild. I didn't mean to." And then, without another word, he turned and stepped into the room. A second later, a shot rang out. Dr. Fishbaugh rushed forward, pushing open the heavy door. What he saw inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. 2 bodies, 1 gun, and a silence that not even a house as grand as Greystone could contain. The sound of the gunshot was still echoing through the corridor when Dr. Fishbaugh burst into the room. For a heartbeat, he froze. The grandeur of the guest bedroom clashed violently with the scene inside. Soft lamplight spilled across the Persian rugs and mahogany furniture, illuminating a horror that didn't belong. Ned Doheny lay slumped against the floor near the settee, motionless, blood pooling beneath his head. Just feet away, Hugh Plunkett's body was crumpled near the doorway, a pistol still loosely in his hand. The silence was suffocating. Lucy stood in the hallway behind the doctor, her hand pressed to her mouth, eyes wide but dry. She didn't scream, she didn't rush forward. She simply stared, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that no longer made sense. Dr. Fishbaugh bent over the bodies. It was clear both men were dead. But the arrangement of the scene? It was strange. Ned's wound wasn't fresh. He'd been dead longer than Hugh. And Hugh's face, though lifeless, still bore the creases of torment, as though he'd been crying, pleading, unraveling. There was no note, no confession, just blood and silence. And yet, no one called the police. Not right away. Instead, Lucy instructed the doctor to secure the room and contact Edward Doheny Sr., the patriarch, the tycoon, the man whose name could summon senators and silence reporters. A man who had faced down federal charges in the infamous Teapot Dome bribery scandal and walked away untouched. A man who had built empires with oil and reputation. By the time the authorities were contacted, over 2 hours had passed. The call that finally came in to the Beverly Hills Police Department was vague and formal. A shooting had occurred at Greystone. 2 men were dead. The family was distraught. When detectives arrived at the mansion, the scene had already been altered. The bodies had been moved slightly. Servants had been sent home. And any diary, letter, or evidence that might have explained what had happened was nowhere to be found. Detective Lieutenant Les Barrett, a veteran of the force, took one look at the scene and knew something was off. The placement of the gun, the distance between the bodies, the fact that Dr. Fishbaugh had been allowed to examine and likely disturb the crime scene before police were even called. Still, within hours, the case was being closed. The conclusion? A murder-suicide. Hugh Plunkett, described as mentally unstable, had snapped. Killed his friend, then turned the gun on himself. It was clean, quick, convenient. Too convenient. Reporters, sensing something more, began to gather outside the gates of Greystone, but they were kept back by private security, hired not by the city, but by Edward Doheny Sr. Inside, the family grieved privately. No statement, no interviews, no answers. Whispers began to spread. What had driven Hugh Plunkett to such an act? Why hadn't Lucy called the police immediately? Why did the official story feel so rehearsed? And perhaps most haunting of all, why did no one seem surprised? By the morning of February 17th, 1929, news of the double death at Greystone had exploded across Los Angeles like a thunderclap. Two men, one the son of one of the richest oil barons in America, the other his devoted secretary, dead in a locked room inside one of the grandest homes ever built. The press camped outside the mansion gates, desperate for a quote, a photo, a glimpse of grief. But the Doheny family had already moved into silence. They released only one statement. Hugh Plunkett was unwell. He suffered from nervous troubles. It was a terrible tragedy. No funeral photos, no interviews. The curtains of Greystone were drawn, and the story, the official version of it, was printed before detectives had finished their coffee. Hugh had snapped, they said, strained by mental illness, possibly even guilt tied to the family's lingering scandal. He came to the mansion. He and Ned argued. He pulled a gun, shot his friend, then killed himself. But behind closed doors, investigators were beginning to ask questions no one seemed eager to answer. Detective Leslie T. White, a meticulous investigator with the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, arrived on the scene a full day later. He walked the halls of Greystone, spoke to staff, examined the bedroom, and reviewed the timeline. Almost immediately, the contradictions leapt out. First, the position of the bodies. According to the official report, Hugh shot Ned, then turned the gun on himself. But Ned's wound appeared to have happened earlier. His blood had dried and pooled, while Hugh's was fresh. If Hugh had killed Ned in a fit of passion, why wait to take his own life? What had happened during those missing hours? Second, the state of the room. Despite two supposed gunshots, there were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no scratches, no signs that Ned had even tried to resist. It was as if both men had calmly accepted their fate. Third, the delay in contacting police. Lucy had called the family doctor, waited nearly an hour before even entering the room, and then another hour or more passed before law enforcement was summoned. In that time, the scene had been touched, moved, perhaps even manipulated. And then there was the final question. Why was Hugh even at the mansion that night? Some reports claimed he arrived unexpectedly. Others said he'd been summoned by Ned himself. But no one could produce a clear answer. Staff were told to forget what they heard. Lucy's account changed slightly each time she gave it. And Edward Sr.? He refused to speak to detectives altogether. When White submitted his doubts in a report, it was buried. Political pressure weighed heavy. The Doheny name still held sway, and after the Teapot Dome scandal had nearly shattered the family's reputation, no one in power wanted another scandal on the front page. So the official record stood. Hugh Plunkett, mentally unwell, murdered Ned Doheny in a moment of madness. Case closed. But beneath the surface, Los Angeles was already buzzing. Journalists, historians, and even old Hollywood insiders whispered another truth, that what happened inside Greystone that night was no simple murder-suicide. And over the decades, those whispers would grow into theories. Dangerous ones. Long before Greystone was built, before the gunshots, and before Ned Doheny Jr. became a name whispered in true crime circles, there was another headline: Teapot Dome. It was 1922 when the scandal first erupted, a tangled, oil-slicked tale of bribery and backroom deals that reached the highest levels of the U.S. government. At the center of it was Albert B. Fall, Secretary of the Interior under President Warren G. Harding, who had leased oil reserves in Wyoming and California to private companies without competitive bidding. And one of those companies? Pan American Petroleum, tied directly to Edward L. Doheny Sr. The elder Doheny was accused of bribing Fall with $100,000 in cash, delivered personally by Ned Doheny Jr. and Hugh Plunkett. It was a shocking revelation. Two young men acting as couriers for a bribe that would go on to become the most notorious corruption case in American history. The headlines were bold. The implications were enormous. But Edward Sr., ever the chess player, avoided prison. He claimed the money was a loan between friends. The jury believed him. Albert Fall wasn't so lucky. He became the first U.S. cabinet member ever convicted and imprisoned for crimes committed while in office. But while the case closed in court, the scandal never truly died, and neither did its consequences. By 1929, the whispers had turned to warnings. New investigations were brewing. Political tides were shifting. And with Ned and Hugh still deeply tied to the events of that bribe, still carrying the burden of the cash they once delivered, the pressure was building. Some historians believe Hugh, already a nervous and sensitive man, was unraveling under the weight of it all. If he was ever called to testify again, what might he say? Who might he protect? Who might he expose? Others believe the danger wasn't from within, but from without. Too much was at stake for the Doheny family. Their fortune, their influence, their name. Some saw the murder-suicide narrative as suspiciously convenient, too neat, too fast, too perfect. And still, the strangeness of that February night lingered like a shadow behind velvet drapes. Why would Ned invite Hugh to Greystone late at night if tension had been brewing? Why didn't any of the servants hear raised voices? Or a confrontation? Why was Lucy so calm, so composed, when death hung in the very air? The Los Angeles Times printed only what they were told. The police followed orders. The story, at least the public one, was settled. But in back rooms, cigar lounges, and quiet corners of the city, people talked. And what they said was always the same. There's no way Hugh pulled that trigger. Not first. Not like that. The truth, they claimed, had been buried along with the bodies. And Greystone, like the scandal it was built on, would never let go of its ghosts. Years passed. The newspapers faded. The headlines turned to new scandals, new tragedies. The Great Depression swept across the country, silencing the jazz and opulence that once defined the 1920s. But high above Beverly Hills, the Greystone mansion stood frozen in time. It had never truly been a home, not after that night. Lucy Doheny and her children remained there for a while, attempting to carry on. But something in the house had changed. Servants whispered of cold drafts in rooms with no windows open. Guests refused to stay overnight in the East Wing. The silence in the hallways was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. Eventually, Lucy remarried and moved out. The house was sold, leased, used for film shoots and city functions. It passed from one owner to another, but no one ever stayed long. And always the same question lingered. What really happened the night Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett died? No new evidence ever surfaced. No confession letter. No witness who changed their story. The official verdict, murder-suicide, remained untouched. But the inconsistencies, the contradictions, the delays, and the motive that never quite made sense kept the mystery alive. Historians continued to dig. Theories multiplied. Did Hugh discover a betrayal too painful to bear? Was Ned silenced to protect family secrets or family fortune? Was the tragedy born of madness or of power's cold calculation? And then there was the room itself. To this day, the guest bedroom where the two men died remains closed to the public. Greystone Mansion, now owned by the city of Beverly Hills, operates as a park and filming location. It has appeared in countless movies: Batman, The Big Lebowski, There Will Be Blood. But the true drama it holds remains behind locked doors. Tour guides sometimes lower their voices when passing that corridor. Some claim to hear soft footsteps or feel a strange heaviness in the air. Others see nothing, but still know something waits in that wing. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but a story that refuses to die.